Hello, welcome to Associates by Charities webinar. And I'm super excited in terms of, you see the panelists that have joined us today who I will be introducing, but I'm also super excited in terms of this issue of transit is so core to the issue of closing the racial wealth gap for Black and Brown workers. As every one of you know who are joining us this morning, as all of our panelists know, that Black and Brown workers, Black and Brown students are not broken. Absolutely, there's greatness in Black and Brown, and what we know is happening is our systems that cause some challenges for us in terms of we're going to learn about those challenges today, and we're going to learn about what we can do about removing some of those barriers for Black and Brown workers in terms of the space. This is for us, Associated Black Charities, how we pivoted during COVID in terms of, first of all, hoping everyone is doing well and healthy out there in terms of and staying safe and going out to vote. But we also pivoted in terms of being clear that we had to focus and continue around this issue of closing the racial wealth gap. And we said and set out very clearly that we understood that racial wealth gap in Baltimore, as it is across this country, is core root of it is around structural racism. There's no two ways around it. It is simply that. And to address that meant that we had to look at what that looked like for the workforce ecosystem. And as I indicated, transportation is a very much part of that ecosystem and moving forward. And just to give you a little bit of facts in terms of around this area that the staff prepared, and I want to share with you in terms of according to the 2018 US Census data, in Baltimore City, Black workers make up 40.2% of the workforce. But they make up 68.8% of people relying on public transportation to those jobs. Those racial disparities clearly existed, as you see from the numbers before the pandemic. However, COVID-19, as we all know, in this city, in this country, has exposed structural disadvantages that low income but Black people face in this country, in this city, each and every day. But transit workers, in terms of predominantly women of color, they don't have the, and Black workers don't have the luxury of staying home. We know that from essential workers and who that is. ABC did a workforce study about 2 years ago, University of Baltimore, in terms of what did that look like, the patterns of employment. And we know the patterns of employment for Black and Brown workers on low wage jobs and for high wage sectors, sectors that have opportunity for them to move up. We know that too is about structural racism. But it also recently, GBC released a paper, Preparing for the Future, a regional workforce development initiative that actually forecasts the top 20 family-sustaining careers, and they offered a number of recommendations, and they continue to acknowledge the issue of the need to pay attention to racial equity and a regional transportation system. I think this is a point in time where we all come together in terms of academics, in terms of employers, the larger business community, workers, and advocates and all. We know this is a time we must do something about this barrier and for workers. If this were in fact a barrier for people that were white, this would not be the barrier that it is today. And we've got to be able to call that out and talk about it. And with that, I'm going to stop talking about the larger picture and begin to introduce the panelists so that we can go to those questions and you can hear directly from them. Dr. Chavis Davis, in terms of welcome and thank you for being with us today. In terms of Dr. Davis is associate professor at Morgan State University and jointly appointed in the Departments of Transportation, Urban Infrastructure Studies, and Civil Engineering. And so her research focuses on planning, operations, safety of multimodal transportation systems through an equity lens. I'm really excited to hearing about that, but I also know a big part of also that focus has also been around students and the impact in terms of education, a whole range. So we're looking forward to you and the questions you'll be addressing for us, Dr. Davis. Dr. Davis, is your preference, Dr. Chavis, for me to call you Chelsea or Dr. Chavis?
I have no preference. Celeste is fine.
Celeste is fine, Celeste. And I want to go to, okay, Sefu Chikelu. In terms of, I ask him, and forgive me from the beginning in terms of mispronouncing his name, in terms of, but I'm really excited that you're here. We made a commitment in doing this panel as well as any panel going forward. We will always have a worker of color participate. We can't have these conversations without workers that are impacted by this very issue. And so we thank you for joining us. But as I said to you, in terms of as we were introducing the panelists before we began to the public, is that we welcome you, we claim you as a Baltimore resident. You've been with us for 6 years, but you come from Charleston, South Carolina, where you can talk about the very issue of transit and the sense of brokenness of those systems, both Baltimore and Charleston. And so thank you for joining us today. And so I have to tell you that I'm going to claim that I have two friends on this, people that one that I'm just meeting, one I've known for many years, but I'm claiming all of you as friends, but I have to tell you, I'm claiming this person as I introduce Samuel Jordan as my new best friend in terms of the space around transit equity, in terms of that he needs no introduction for those of you in the transit lane, in terms of Samuel Jordan founded the Baltimore Transit Equity Coalition in 2016 to complete the Baltimore Red Line light rail project and recover its transformative economic benefits for the Baltimore metropolitan region for African Americans, Hispanic, low-income, transit-dependent community. You have to understand in terms of he's been an advisor in Washington for DC Department of Transportation. He's been on national panels. This is a person that's gone deep, deep, deep in terms of understanding what this means about transit, not just the very issue, but the whole issue in terms of financing, the modality, what does that look like, and what's really possible versus what people would tell us is possible. And so I'm really looking forward in terms of Mr. Jordan, in terms of not just answering questions, but the partnership that we will have with you going forward. And Jonathan Moore, as I said to him, I know him from history in terms of the city, having been very focused as a business entrepreneur in this space, but a passion in terms of technology and technology in terms of the Black community. And I know that you lately have been involved in that space of technology of creating hotspots and Wi-Fi in different parts of the city. See, I knew that in terms of I've actually followed you as you've been involved in this work recently, and a number of very elaborate background in terms of in business that he's been involved in, but always around the area of tech training, workforce, and making a difference for Black and Brown communities. And so thank you very much, Jonathan, for joining us this morning. The last person I want to introduce in terms of I absolutely claim as a friend in terms of Jim Shea, and someone as we asked the panelists for their bio, so I get this little tiny clip from bio from Jim, which has nothing to do with his bio in terms of all the things that Jim has done. But Jim was the managing chair previously of Venable, which is a 700 law firm here in Baltimore. They're in Baltimore, DC, New York, and California. He was at role from 1994 to 2017, but Jim is still an attorney in terms of at Venable, in terms of that, and I guess emeritus in terms of chair, but Jim is more than that. In terms of Jim also ran for governor. Jim was my chair for Empower Baltimore Management Corporation. Jim is actually the chair and part of the beginning for Central Maryland Transportation Alliance. And that's also where you go deep in terms of the issue of transportation. But it's been board member, chair of Downtown Partnership, U.S. Board of Regents, you actually chaired that. Jim has a whole array in terms of, but he brings to this focus, he understands clearly that from a business, from a father, from every perspective, transit is critical for the success of this region. And so with that, I've introduced our panelists, and I want to again say welcome to all of you and welcome to you, the audience, and thank you for being here. We have a number of questions we have posed and we will be posing to the panelists. We want to have them have an opportunity to share their information with us, but we will also leave time. We will end the questions with them and we'll ask them to make some closing remarks, but we want to end the questions and answers from them around 11:30 to allow you, the audience, to pose questions for the panelists. I urge you to put your questions in the Q&A as we go along the way. We'll come back to them because you have to be a part of making this difference. We hope that you see this as an opportunity, if you're not already engaged, to become actively engaged and bringing about the change we need in transit. And so with that, I'm going to begin with question number one. And we have four of the panelists that want to give a response to the question number one. But let me share it and then I will go to our panelists. The recent rescinding of the transit cuts is considered a win to the transit advocates community, as it proves that transportation is interwoven into our economic fabric. Absolutely. The success of this win was successful due to the collective impact from individuals and groups representing the transit advocates, school, neighborhood leaders, the environmental and business communities, and elected officials. What does this say to moving the needle for systemic change for Baltimore's transit system? And I'm going to start with Celeste. I'm going to start with you. I'm going to go ladies first.
Thank you. I mean, it was definitely a win, but it was a win that we shouldn't, for a fight that we shouldn't have had to be fighting, I would say. I think the thought of making such drastic cuts, particularly to our local bus system, was very, was just been drastic, we have drastic impacts to the workers of Baltimore. So while I do think it's a win, I think we shouldn't be comfortable in the fact that we were able to have the short win. There's going to be some very difficult decisions that are going to have to be made given the status of the Transportation Trust Fund that's only been exacerbated by COVID. And so while we did have a win, I think we really need to think about long-term solutions and the fact that because it is a state-run agency, it is subjected to kind of political whims. And so I think we need to think about kind of long-term ways of making sure we're not in this position again.
Okay, thank you. Sefu, I saw you nodding your head. I'm going to go to you next because I know you want to jump in on this question.
Yeah, first off, I just want to say thank you to the Associated Black Charities for having me. And I'm very fortunate to have moved here at a time where I experienced the bus system before the link system. And so before the orange, I remember those late nights riding the 23 Fox Ridge from my job in this city out into Dundalk at the time where I was staying. I'm nodding my head because it's very true. And I think that what it also shows is that there has always been pushback against the transit system. There's this idea that, you know, it's very recent that there's been pushback, or that the pushback hasn't been as strong or as heavy until very recently. But as long as I've been living here, there's been serious pushback against the way that the transit system is being ran and operated in the city. And we can see that even through the hearings that were happening between mid-2016 and early January 2017, where there were 14 hearings on the Baltimore Link proposed system. And even until the meeting that was held in August of 2017 with the transit union, where we packed out the war memorial and we basically cried out saying that this was not feasible to any Black workers in the city. And so I just think that it's very indicative of the fact this is on something that we have been pushing, something that has been on the forefront of our minds as transit workers. And I think that it also shows us that public transit should be pushed even further into our cries for social justice, even on a larger Black Lives Matter level. You know, in our cries for justice, how can we further incorporate public transit into that? Because transit is always, it's never in the forefront. It's always somewhere towards the end. How can we push the leverage a little bit forward in our cries for social justice when it comes to transit equity in the city?
Thank you. And Jim, you wanted to answer this one as well.
Yeah, it was a victory. It was a win, as Dr. Chavis has said. And it was a demonstration of how a coalition can form, and I believe can form around transit issues in particular, transportation, because everyone is interested in a good transit system for their own purposes, but they do tend to unite because it's good for the workers and it's good for the businesses to have good transportation. So there were some pluses there, but it was, as is too often, reactive. The issue came up. In fact, we'd already had it cut, and everybody reacted, and unfortunately reacted effectively. But that's not the way to make a pun. That's not a way to run the railroad. What you need to do is plan in advance. As my business career, I've been a great advocate of planning. If you don't plan, then pretty much any way you go will do, is an old saying. You need to be effective and coherent and united in where you're going. And we've recently had the unfortunate experience in Central Maryland of having a transit planning commission, which I served on. and honestly, which came up with no plan at all, except to reinforce the status quo, which embeds the systemic racism into Central Maryland even further. So we have a long way to go, and I honestly believe it needs to begin with effective planning.
Thank you, Jim. Samuel. Samuel, you're on mute.
I have, yes. Thank you. And Diane, yours was an extremely gracious introduction. Thank you so much. I really would like to sort of, with the audience in mind as well, just begin with a pretty simple, call them verities. You know, sometimes I would like to start just asking people to take a deep breath, then take another deep breath, and let them know, as we can all agree, we have never taken one breath living in the United States that was not governed by white supremacy. Not one. That's a subtext, I think, of a discussion about public transportation. Public transportation has always been racially conflicted wherever people of color live. One reason, and I'm sort of promoting the Netflix Driving While Black. Public transportation has also always been an instrument of control and management of people of color in their communities. This recent round of proposed transit cuts, we're calling it a win. Fine, they've been rescinded, but rescinded completely. And I believe they were rescinded completely because the system could not defend the cuts. You would think that if the agency had some confidence in its decisions to make reductions and or cancellation of routes, they would have some confidence that at least one of those decisions was appropriate and needed, but they defended none of them and they rescinded all of them for that reason. I want to just go back to a couple of things. On October 20th, MTA Administrator Kevin Quinn and I were guests on Tom Hall's Midday with Tom Hall on WYPR. A well-listened, a very popular program. At the end of his remarks, Kevin Quinn said, "Equity," and I quote, "equity is absolutely critical to us." And this is October 20th. This is just 20 days after he's had to rescind the proposed transit cuts. Another 30 days prior when he proposed them. So why is he now saying that equity is absolutely critical to us when it was the equity issue that pushed an amazing coalition to force rescission of those cuts? We want to keep that coalition together. But I want to mention this. If those cuts and their inequity, in fact, racist impacts, were so clear to all of us, why weren't they clear to M.MTA? If equity is absolutely critical to us, as Quinn says. It's contradictory, but it's a running contradiction. We have an issue here of correcting something that can be corrected if we are aware that structural racism stands right in the middle of the town square, hiding in plain sight. We think that structural racism must be met with structural change, but I want to get to that. With respect to these cuts, the cuts themselves were grossly imbalanced. 20% cuts in the core bus service, but not more than 8% in the other modals, commuter bus, commuter rail. They serve a very different demographic. 26% of the ridership on commuter rail is Black, while 83% of the ridership on core bus services is African American and Brown, Latinos, for example. So what we're getting at here is that not only did M.MTA maintain the position of African American riders when thinking of their cuts, when proposing their cuts, but we have to understand that the assumptions and policies preceded the cuts. They were not free of this continuing management of African Americans, people of color, with public transportation, but also a kind of caste arrangement where it was understood that if there were going to be burdens, they must be borne by the people at the bottom of the caste hierarchy. That's us. The burdens, these cuts were not balanced in the ports. The seaport, that is the airport, the seaport, didn't get 20% cuts. You know that the highway widening program on I-270 and 495 did not get 20% cuts. In fact, They got no cuts whatsoever. Yet, this $9 billion traffic relief plan from Governor Hogan is an absolute 100% guaranteed failure. We all know on this panel that widening highways, even with toll lanes, is not the answer to addressing congestion. Within 1 to 3 years or 2 to 5 years, the congestion will be back worse than before. It's a 100% guaranteed failure. Yet, investments in light rail, for example, return $4 on every dollar invested. Why isn't that smarter for a smart, financially wise governor? I want to bring my remarks to a close on this point. But what I'm getting at is this. This was an example also of shock doctrine. It is popularized by Naomi Klein, but not originated there. But so many have discussed this fact that times of disaster is when a predatory agency or corporation, government acts on its most vulnerable. The cuts proposed for the core bus service were to be permanent cuts. The cuts proposed for commuter bus and commuter rail were temporary cuts. What we want to do, moving to something on the brighter side, is demand, in fact, in legislation, if we can, that any such cuts and changes in policy of this type must be preceded by transit equity analysis, by cost benefit analysis. Where do these costs and benefits fall? By consultation with the leaders and members of the communities most directly affected, and with the offer of alternatives if they can be made available. We have a lot to say, I'm sure, as the others do about this issue, but we need to make sure that happens before any such cuts of this type can be proposed in the future. And we don't have to blame M.MTA for racist policy. They are mired in racist policy. They are maintaining Baltimore's tradition in segregationist, racist transportation policy.
Thank you very much, Samuel, for that, and we will come back to you. I want to go to the second question because I want to hear, Jonathan, I understand that you wanted to address this, and I'm going to read the question out because both as an entrepreneur, but you also are a transit rider in terms of that. And I have described what we have here in Baltimore in terms of our transit system. It really is this century's version of redlining in terms of, in so many ways, it absolutely is in my analysis of it. But historically, transportation discrimination was implemented through segregation of buses and trains. Yet today's discriminatory practices and policies still exist, sometimes in subtle form, sometimes the quality of service, efficiency of service, the amenities provided to suburban rail versus inner city bus lines. In addition to the systemic, the public health crisis caused by COVID-19 virus, required a level of maintenance, upkeep, and practices to ensure the safety of its employees and riders. As a transit rider, what would you say to those about your experience riding public transportation during the pandemic and the subtle forms of system discrimination?
Oh, it's absolutely dismal. If I go from one Black neighborhood to the next Black neighborhood and it's across town, that's either an hour and a half to 2 hours. There are times that you're on the bus stop going from one neighborhood to the next neighborhood, anywhere up to 3.5 hours, and you're just waiting. It's what they're not considering is the culture that the bus brings through their frontline employees, because they make the difference in relieving stress in individuals because they have relationships, and those relationships go far. And those relationships can either make or break your day. And I look at it as also as a continued eradication of culture in Black and brown communities doing transportation. And it's not really helping with any aspects of social determinants of health. So this, I look at it as a public health concern, because when you're sitting on the bus stop and you're waiting and you're looking at the app, and the next thing you know, the bus is supposed to be there in 2 minutes, and then the app refreshes and it's not there for another 59 minutes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it happens all the time. Or the one, you know, when you're going to be late, when you see one bus, then a minute later you see another bus, and then you see a third bus all going in the same direction. And you know you're going to be late no matter how long you get, how early you get there. when the bus is on time, you can feel the energy of the people getting on the bus. And it's amazing when a good day is when you make your buses on time and it's less than a 2 or 3 minute wait. And there's a collective energy around that. When it's late, people are distressed because they're going to be late for work. They're going to be late to any appointment, their doctor's appointment. For one example, I went from Sandtown to Morgan State, and it took me 3.5 hours. And that was on a beautiful day. That doesn't make any sense. Now, as an employer, in order to, we consider hiring someone, we ask, what is your transportation route? And how do we hire people in certain areas that can only take one bus route? Because if you have to take two, that's 1.5 hours to 2.5 hours late. Now, if it's raining or it's snowing and you got to take 2 bus routes, that's 3.5 hours. And so as an employer, you have to take those things into consideration. And so it's if I'm going from a poor neighborhood to a wealthy white neighborhood that's in the L, I'm on time. Always on time. You know, it never fails. If I'm going from one white neighborhood to another white neighborhood, I'm always on time. And so when you start to look at these things, it's what's following gentrification, what's helping to contribute to the disparities that are in place or adding to, because as we know, stress is a precursor to every chronic illness in the Black and brown community. Mm-hmm. And so how is this keeping people on the hamster wheel for a reason? And I want to know what that reason is, to be honest.
Tammy, did you have your finger up that you wanted to respond to that? Did I see
yes,
that?
only quickly, and I think Jonathan is on an important path. You know, we're speaking about relating this to the Black wealth gap. One of the issues that arises is, you know, for Black people, brown people, low-income people, anyone using public transportation wants to save money that is in time spent in the commute. That time is a cost to them that MDOT/MTA refuses to accept our challenge to calculate. We calculate about $375 million a year lost in detention. We call that transit detention. 3 to 4 hours of your day, every day you work, when you're lucky enough to have one of those $11 jobs out in the county, you're gonna spend 3 hours or more captive to a dysfunctional transportation system. But a dysfunctional transportation system itself is part of the wealth gap. That is, poor transportation is directly associated with low wages, high turnover. We want to address that question when we talk about the last mile. But this idea of the employers that Jonathan mentioned, and I'll just touch on this, we want and propose when the governor made his proposed cut on March 17th, and another coalition like the one that caused the rescission of the cuts formed, immediately pushed that back. But something emerged there that we want to follow up. Employers should determine and identify their transit-dependent riders in their staff. Talk to them, treat them like people, but talk to them and get some ideas about how we can make this better for everybody, including those in your employ. Flexibility in start times, flexibility in shift schedules, so we can flatten the curve, but understand the health problems, but understand also that last mile barrier of when the transit has gone as far as it can take you and you still have 1.5 miles to get to work. You're gonna have to walk. This round of cuts that we get back to was a way to say to African Americans, and especially the essential workers that we spent March, April, May praising the high heavens, you're gonna have to walk to work and your children are gonna have to walk to school. Nothing could be more unfair.
Thank you. I want to stay along that same conversation because the next question is in fact related to how transit is related to this very issue of economic outcomes for Baltimore's residents. And what does the data say that relationship to transit? I want to go to Jim and Sefu in terms of answer, but that really is the core in terms of all this. And I know that CMTA, Jim, for all of its existence, has gotten very clear around the role of transit in economic outcomes in terms of lots of corporate and others in terms of that understand that. And you want to share more about what that relationship is from your perspective.
Yeah, as I mentioned in answer to my first question, and I'm sorry, apparently people couldn't hear me very well when I spoke earlier. I hope it's better now. Send a chat if it's not. I mentioned that coalitions can form around transportation because it's in everyone's best interest to get people to work, honestly. And here's a statistic that the MTA and MDOT don't like to have me say, but I've said it at every turn. And that is in the Baltimore area in central Maryland, if you have a car, you can get to 100% of the jobs if you're willing to drive up to an hour, 100%. If you don't have a car, 10% of the jobs are available to you within an hour. What that means is that for communities that are distressed in particular, there's no way out. There's no way to get to a job, or very little way to get to a job to start to move to narrow that wealth gap. So that hurts, obviously, the people in the community, but it also hurts the employers because they don't have a pool of employees that is broad as it could be, nowhere near as broad as it could be. And that divide hurts the tax base for the city because if people can't get to work, they can't earn money. And if they don't earn money, they don't pay much, if anything, in the way of taxes. In fact, you could be president of the United States and not pay taxes too. I understand that. But to build the tax base is extremely important for our broader city. So all of these things coalesce. And what we need are small improvements, absolutely. But we also need big improvements. We need big, bold ideas. And that's why I had hopes for that planning commission. And I was so disappointed when the ideas were timid and small, because that will never get us where we need to go. And there are obvious opportunities. Samuel has worked night and day to revive or resurrect the Redline project. I'm all with him on that. A transportation line east-west across Baltimore is crucial. Honestly, we need one north-south, not parallel to the two light rail and metros that we have, but that runs from the southwest to the northeast up to Morgan State. We need that well. And I am happy to say that those are two corridors that are starting to be studied. We need to get behind that and push those because therein lies the hope for our city. I'll stop there. There's plenty more to say.
Thanks, Jim. Sefu, I want to go to you. And as I go to you to answer that question in terms of the impact, I also want to share in terms with people that I actually know, employers, in terms of that last mile, in terms of actually example, which I won't name the employer, will have purchased a bicycle or purchased something to help that employee get to that last mile. But I also know employers, I've heard the stories of workers who've lost their job in terms of, as Jonathan and others talk about, how long in transit takes to get there, in terms of you get 3 outs in terms of being late and you're fired, no ifs, ands, or buts. And transit's been a great contributor to that. And so, but people want to talk about something about Black or brown workers. They don't want to work or we know that's a fallacy and we've got to continue. So Sefu, share with us for your take on this in terms of related to economic outcomes.
Absolutely. Within my time of me living here, I don't think that I've ever had a job that wasn't outside of the White L. And so while all of my jobs within the past 6 years has been within the White L, I have consistently lived in the Black Butterfly on the East Side. The one and only exception to that was I did work at Amazon briefly on Bronan Highway, where the bus only ran once an hour, and if you missed it, you were screwed. And I appreciate the last comment that you made, because I unfortunately am no longer with Amazon for reasons of tardiness in relation to transit and transportation to get to work. And so it is very real. And I think that what we also need to talk about is how so much of the Black Butterfly uplifts and keeps the White L afloat, and how, a lot of my jobs that I've worked within the White L, I've gotten off really late. They're typically third shift jobs. We're getting off at 3 o'clock in the morning. And it's typically food service, and we'll clean the store, we're ready to go, and everyone who worked the shift is catching the bus, right? So we're serving people within the White L, we're serving residents within the White L just to have to catch a bus at 3-something in the morning to get back to our homes. And so we really do devalue the importance of transportation that can go through the Black Butterfly into the White L, because we play such an important part in places like our house, in places like the gallery, in places like the Rotunda in Hamden, and keeping those businesses and those establishments afloat. And you know, the fact that the 21 bus was proposed to be cut, right? The 21 runs right through Canton, up through the White L, it goes through Remington, it goes through Hamden, and it stops at Woodbury. That's such an important route because so many people take that in order to get to those jobs. And so, yes, it is very important to have that conversation about some of the ways in which not only is it important for us to have reliable transit to get to those areas, but that without those buses, those places within the Rotunda, within our house, within those nice establishments in the White L can't even exist the way that it does.
Thank you. So Celeste, I'm going to skip you on that one, but I'm going to take you to another question that has come up from the audience, but also I know is very dear to you in terms of today's youth and students are the future of the workforce. And Baltimore City high school students have free choice of schools. Thus, they have to rely heavily on the public transportation system to get to and from schools when schools open. In the 2017 report, Getting to High School in Baltimore, Students Commuting in Public Transportation, high school students had an average commute of 36.2 minutes and were considered a large user group of public transportation. In addition, 68% of those students commute required at least one transfer due to mismatch between student housing and school location. With that said, let's talk about what this means for the Baltimore City household, for our students, for multi-generations trying to navigate that. What is this going to mean post-COVID in terms of our students trying to get to school in this environment? How does this impact what we all say? We all can give the platitude that our students mean so much to us and a good education is important. We want our students to go to school. This again, yet is another place because those students happen to be Black and brown that we're not investing in understanding. Can you share with us more about that? So
I'd be happy to. I mean, what's so interesting about the student commute issues is we don't often think of students as commuters when we think about the transit system and how they're working. So a lot of the same things that Jonathan and Sefu has stated about, you know, the stress of the commute, having to make decisions based on where you work and where you live, those same decisions are made for students based on where they work and where they live and where they go to school. So the open choice school system from, you know, an educational standpoint is supposed to, you know, decouple where you live with the opportunities presented in each school. So it says, oh, it doesn't matter if this school doesn't have this resource and school B does, because you can go to any school, you know, if you can get in and there's seats available. But it doesn't look at that stress of how to get to school and then how that impacts their educational outcomes. I mean, if school starts at 7:30 in the morning and you've taken an hour and a half commute to get to school, you've already started your day very stressful. You're already sleep deprived. You have to still make that commute on the way back. And it's really challenging for students. Some of the things we found in our work is that if you look at, for example, the first period, students who have a much longer commute tend to perform worse in their first period because of that stress of having to make those long journeys. And also that unreliability aspect is something that can't be measured when we say, you know, an average time of 36 minutes. That time of 36 minutes was based on the scheduled data. And we all know the schedule and what is in reality are two completely different things. It doesn't take into account that buffer time you need. If you're actually trying to get to school on time, you need to, you know, leave your door for the worst case scenario, for that time when two buses were bunched, or the time when a bus may skip you, which happens quite a bit when you talk to students with overcrowding. And so we were already grappling with overcrowding on the system before COVID. And so now, if you think about, like, we're supposed to be distancing, and that's supposed to be one of the main ways of preventing spread. Well, how are we going to do that when schools are back open? It was already overcrowded. So we're gonna put students in more harm really because of inadequate transportation.
Thank you. I'm actually going to put another question out there that I didn't give you in advance, so I will share this at you now. But I want to put this question out there for all of you, but I'm going to particularly turn to Jonathan and Jim and Sammy, but I want any one of you to feel free to answer. And that is, you know, this comes up as a question from one of our audience members, but it's also been one of my absolutely dying questions in my mind constantly. If we know that making sure that Black and Brown people are gainfully employed in terms of make a difference, as Jim, as everyone knows, in terms of our tax base, make a difference in terms of their families, in terms of supporting their families, make a difference. Because we also know what our data is that Black and Brown people want to work. This is not about somebody not wanting to work. This is not about the stereotypes and the lies about Black and Brown people don't want to work. That's not true. But the question I would ask in terms of that is, if we know transit is a big part of that, and transit is a problem in terms of keeping people from accessing the availability of jobs in terms of in the YL, availability of jobs in terms of out there, and people, there's a ready supply of people want to do that, but transit stands in a way, but transit leads to being somebody losing their job because you're late, and the trauma, what that is. My question is, why aren't employers more engaged, more actively standing up in terms of pushing back on this? And how do we get employers to be more engaged and understand this impact and get the voice in terms of, as the short term of the transit cuts, like how do we help people understand from an employer perspective, Jonathan, that this is essential? And I'm going to add one other perspective, because I know there a person out there is listening is in this lane, and that is, even when we think about investing in businesses, even when we think about equity investments in terms of front buy, should we not make sure, as we're talking about that investment for employers, that we really lift up this issue of transit, because it really is a big part about moving the needle economically? Jonathan.
Yes, we changed our business, we changed our model, and we started to figure out, how do we build out local worker-owned cooperatives, where, for instance, we're in Brooklyn, Curtis Bay, and Cherry Hill. Now that becomes a work-owned cooperative. Now, when we talk about transportation as a barrier, we know that if you live in Cherry Hill, you need to get to Brooklyn. That's one bus line. And so we had to really think about that, because people really wanted the opportunity. But when they consistently show up in 45 minutes, half an hour, hour and a half late, and we're already in motion, now they're bringing stress onto a job site where it's more stress. And now their focus is someplace else, and it becomes a liability when you climb up a ladder or using power tools. And so, you know, it's a lot of entrepreneurs look at the system as just being, it's falling on deaf ears. You know, we aren't big enough. You know, as loud as we can talk and as loud as we can shout and as much as we can control the narrative, it just falls on deaf ears. So we have to address, we have to find ways to address it immediately. And so there are a lot of people that are changing their business model, the way that they hire individuals based on where they live, because it's that 2 bus line. When you have to connect to another bus or another something else, then you're not, if you can't afford an Uber or a scooter or a hack, you know, there's a problem. And I remember I was someplace and I had to catch a bus. I caught a bus home, and I was on a bus stop at 3:30 in the morning. And the next bus didn't come till like 6:30 in the morning, because they literally shut bus routes down at specific times at wee hours in the morning, and you're just waiting. Mm-hmm. And so it's you really have to talk to your employees, like Sam said, talk to your employees and just be engaged and find out, how can I help you get here? You know, let's really understand the barriers. And sometimes you have to adjust your schedule based on where people are coming from, so you allow them to have time to get there, because even if you get at the bus stop 45 minutes early, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. And so it's constant communication, and it's constant texting, and it's over communication, because you're not looking at the individuals being bad. It's just their circumstance to get to employment just sucks. and it continues to suck, and it continues to get worse. And when the weather changes, it's going to continue to it's just a horrible situation for people.
So, Jim, I want to go to you because, I really have a hard time wrapping my head around this. Having been in this focus around economic development for a long time, this costs businesses. It costs their bottom line. Are people so disposable that they're not willing to lift their voice in terms of, because it's costing them? And I understand that may not understand the value or believe in the value of Black and brown people that got some education to go, but this is costing, it's in their pocket. Why is the business community not standing up louder around this issue? Or are they, and where are they?
Well, if they are, they haven't been enough of them and they haven't been loud enough. So, and the question why lingers. It absolutely covers all of what we're talking about. And the answer in the first and most general instance is systemic racism. White supremacy is many things, but it's also blindness. It's just blind. So what ABC is doing by making systemic racism your main issue and opening eyes to it and making people understand that the transit system reinforces the segregation and wealth gap and the unfairness and the economic problems that it creates. So systemic racism lies at the root of why we're mired in the status quo. But when you get to transportation, once people's eyes are opened, you need to tackle two truths about bold transportation plans. One is it costs a lot of money up front. And two, it takes a fairly long time, I might even say a long time, to have bold new transit plans. And in fact, one of the audience points out that the red line and the two new corridors also must embrace rail and not just wheel buses. And that's absolutely true. But politicians and people don't like things that take a long time to happen. Politicians are in office for 4, maybe 8 years. A good transportation plan takes 10 or 15, maybe even 20 years to execute. It costs a lot of money, and people, particularly in today's world, they want to hold on to their money. There's a greed that underlies all of this. Not only do I want money, I want it now. And I want it on my plate. And that perspective totally blunts a transportation plan that takes time and costs money. We have to have the political will to make investments, to make our community stronger. And we need to open people's eyes and get them of the mindset to make those investments that are so important. They're important to us, everyone on this call, but they're really, really important to our children and our grandchildren and those that come after. Those are the people that we owe so much to, and we've got to open eyes for people to see that.
I'm going to go to, thank you. I'm going to go to a policy, the public policy conversation now then, because if we all are saying the same thing in terms of that clarity, but with the whole issue of, we all know that there's a broken transportation system infrastructure. How should policymakers ensure their role in this, the implementation, decision-making, that racial equity, inclusion, all that's involved in the state system? What do we need? How do we get there? Samuel, how do we get there? Samuel, unmute, please.
Yes, of course. And thank you. I think there are a couple of things that can be done. One is we have to commit. Jim mentioned something that's of importance to all the communities, particularly the business community. Investments. You invest in your business to make it more profitable. Well, we have to look at what kind of investments are made in transit. If the agency commits to inequitable investments, they're also committing to inequitable impacts. And that's a key for the business community. You see, when the link was launched, the agency did not invest in what a transportation system needs. There was no origins and destination study when the link was launched. How do you know where people want to go? There's been no real investment in reduced commute times. How do we save money in that commute? Okay, there were no investments in the kind of tech we need. There's some, I mean, there's, you know, we now have an app, you have a transit app, but you've got to have investments in the systems that we need. For example, there were no investments in repair of the tracks on the subway line. For 15 months, MDOT/MTA played Russian roulette with the lives of 40,000 people a day because they refused to make the repairs when they knew the repairs should have been made. In November 2016, they knew, but they didn't make them until February 2018. They did not invest. So it cost a lot more. Had they repaired them in 2016, it would have been $800,000. But now in 2018, when they had to cut the system down, it cost a bus bridge of $2.6 million or more. We don't really know. But the cost rose to over $3.6 million to make repairs that would have cost $800,000. So investments, timely and needed. We are looking ahead. This discussion, obviously, we're saying, one, the MDOT/MTA model does not serve us. It is not appropriate for this region. Structural racism needs to be met with structural change. So we are proposing that we move to a regional transportation authority that gives Baltimore City, Baltimore County, Howard, Hartford, and Arundel counties a better handle on policymaking. We can make policies for us, and we need to do so. And have a better chance, because the highest priority should be the Red Line Light Rail project. It is important, as we've all discussed, because it has a transformative power in the economy. We don't have a real engine of the Baltimore economy. Yet a light rail, the Red Line, 14.2 miles, 19 stations, 10,000 jobs, dramatically reduced commute times. 2 out of 3 jobs in the region cannot be reached within 90 minutes by public transportation. You can listen to Jonathan and cry, okay? We need to invest in the reduction in average commute times. MTA has stopped reporting those. So we need an investment vehicle that's autonomous of Annapolis and MDOT/MTA that permits us to make the decisions that we need that are appropriate for this region.
My question from a public policy standpoint, though, is all of that, why then is that not a part of the public policy discourse in Annapolis, as well as in our city council, in terms of although I know it's not controlled by city council, but in terms of pushing that around, bringing attention to it, so that as we begin to move towards January in terms of Annapolis, that doesn't become a routine conversation that should come up. How do we push that from a public policy perspective that people pay attention to?
I think, Diane, if I weren't too direct or direct enough in response, is that we have learned through a history of racism how to bow to the emperor. Governor Hogan says, I'm cutting it. I'm giving $900 million back to the federal government because I can. And I am a roads and highways man. His roads and highways policies mean that the state highway agency administration gets 77 cents out of every dollar spent on transportation. MTA gets $2. Even the WMATA contribution gets $1. 1% for WMATA, 2% for MDOT/MTA, 77% for state highways administration. And we know that the transit relief plan is going to fail. But we need to challenge these assumptions. Many people believe that we can fight racism. Not very many believe we can defeat it. Well, we can if we aim and do what we know we need for this region. This region needs the generator of economic development. Over the past 5 decades, light rail has not been surpassed in its ability to generate economic development. But this is also what we call community enhancing development. Spinoff, we need to make sure there's production and preservation of affordable housing along the Red Line route. This is not out of the question. It can be built, but we have, as Jim has mentioned, we need to be bolder. We need to look further ahead. I want to just add this question. The question of equity should be just as much a matter of anticipation and prevention as it is now of recovery and correction. Creating a regional transportation authority is anticipatory. It means we're taking into our own hands now the factors that would, without our supervision, lead to the kind of impact that we would have had those cuts been enacted January 3rd that were proposed on September 1st.
So I'm going to go, Celeste, in terms of what you add to that, in terms of all that is critical, what would you also add to that conversation around the policy piece?
I guess for me, I found equity tends to be a buzzword, and I don't think we can rely on people to just choose to be equitable. And so I think for me, coming from like the academic side, I want to see it integrated in our data, integrated in our processes, such as our project prioritization processes, our budget allocation. So I think unless we are actually integrating how we fund and build projects and equity in that lens, we can't expect to see any measurable change. So there's, small things such as getting rid of fare box mandates is a small thing. Looking at when we prioritize projects, are we considering the whole spectrum of benefits and disbenefits of a project, right? Are we looking at the economic benefits, the health benefits of projects? And that's when you really start to see transit kind of rise to the forefront. Are we considering all the disbenefits associated with highways? Right? Are we looking at the immediate benefits and time savings for the next 1 to 2 years? Or are we looking over 20, 25, or the whole lifespan of that system? Are we looking at the noise and health impacts, generational impacts? So I think if we really start thinking about how we choose what projects we pursue and also the funding mechanisms and ensuring that that equity piece is being measured in some key ways, then that's kind of the way forward.
So one of the things that we have, ABC, we created in several different areas of this ecosystem, 10 essential questions for racial equity policy. There's one in that whole space for policy development, and that we ask people to look at, to ask policymakers these questions, the policymakers to take these questions when they're looking at either passing a law or thinking about in terms of changing a law. Those questions begin to surface the issue of equity. So it's not okay to come and say on a radio show, we believe in equity. And so how do you believe in equity? How is that defined in terms of how is that laid out? And so I think you're right. It has to be very demonstrated. And I think we attempt to try to get people help by laying out those 10 essential questions in terms of part of that conversation. But part of this is also around, is there in fact, and I don't know the answer to this, is there in fact ever been done an economic impact analysis around what it costs us in terms of this transit system not having a state-of-the-art transit system? Do we know in a very clear way? I'm not sure it would change minds or hearts, but have we done an economic impact analysis, which is a question from one of our audience. Samuel?
Yes, we've challenged MDOT-MTA to do just that. We spoke about it earlier when we were speaking of the last mile. What does that cost? As was mentioned, Jonathan, I think, and Sefu, that is 3 times 15 minutes late, you lose your job. Get out of here, we call security. No questions asked, no discussion. Well, that costs a lot of money to a lot of people. Families are unstable. Can you imagine the terror when you've come back from Carolina from a visit home and it's Monday morning, you've been late? Your whole family, I mean, they'll get you to work on skateboards with ropes if they have to. That's the terror of this kind of transit system that's dysfunctional. So we want to make sure, I think, that there is a kind of follow through. Dr. Chavis, excellent scholar, of course, on these issues. We do need that kind of study beforehand. That's why I'm saying equity has to be anticipatory, not just let's wait till we have a problem and then try to resolve it. Anticipatory means doing the studies beforehand. I've suggested we needed the demographics. We needed to know what businesses, what schools, what communities would be, for example, adversely impacted by the proposed cuts. MDOT-MTA made no such study. That's why they didn't defend them. So we want to make sure that public policy is forward-looking, for one. This next administration in Baltimore needs, I think, to grasp at least a concept. I won't say they need to grasp our concept, but this idea of merging land use planning with transportation planning and transportation policy. That's the way to get the most out of transportation. Transportation is a force multiplier. It makes things great wherever it's done well, any activity or location in the city, but when it's underinvested, as it is now, it has negative consequences on the, for example, on schools. The first 2 classes in the school year, a school day in middle school and high school, are practically, you know, some places 20% or more tardiness and absenteeism. That's horrible. That's the transportation dysfunction undermining the educational enterprise. It does that everywhere. So it's a force multiplier when it's working well, but when it's underinvested, it also has a multiplier effect, negative. So we need that kind of perspective from the policymakers. We need some boldness. Some of those need to be people, I think, that want to challenge the system that we have, the M.MTA model, and a unilateral, unidimensional approach to transportation by the executive.
So I want to share, because this is also from CMTA in terms of, thank you, Brian O'Malley, in terms of putting into the chat, in terms of the cost of employee turnover, cost the employer to, for hourly workers, it costs an average of $1,500 per employee. And it gives a site in terms of in the chat room. Again, we really do, the economics of this is astronomical in terms of what it costs, both in terms of for the employer, but also what it costs in terms of economic impact for the rider, for families, and for the would-be riders in terms of what it does to us in terms of the city. But I want to begin, I'm mindful of, I'm now moving into the space of making sure I open up for our audience in terms of for the questions they have. And some of the questions I've been trying to blend in as we've gone along. And so I want to bring a question from our audience. Is there any city in the US that is doing this right? Jim?
Yes, and there are plenty of cities worldwide. Has anyone done it perfectly? Of course not. We're humans. But the truth is, there is no great city in the world that doesn't have a great transportation system. Baltimore could be a great city, but it doesn't have a good transportation system, and therefore it's not a great city right now. But New York for years has moved people in and out by the hundreds of thousands every day. Boston has a very effective transportation system. A lot of Boston's system is old. It doesn't always have to be fancy, but it has to be on time. It has to move with reasonable dispatch. It has to be reliable so people know when they can catch the train and when they can't. And Boston has a system that's like that. It needs to be kept up. The Bay Area is interesting. We opened an office in San Francisco, so I got to know the Bay Area pretty well. It's not bad, but it doesn't go everywhere. It's fairly unitary, get from one place to another, get from the airport into the downtown business district, fine. But if you want to go elsewhere in San Francisco, not so easy. Los Angeles has a lousy public transportation system. They're doing, have great plans to improve it, but it's not any good now. Portland has an excellent transportation system. Denver has recently invested a lot of money in a region-wide transportation system. I think it's run into some difficulties now on funding issues, but as a vision, it's excellent. This can be done. It can be done. You need the political will to do it. And Samuel's suggestion of a regional transit authority is exactly how Denver got theirs done. So that's a good way to at least start the long road to a great transportation system.
Somewhat, one of the questions, or actually it's a statement from one of our audience around that what we need in the transit space right now is we need a current-like effort in terms of that mobilization, that multi-facet, multi-sector, everybody coming together around understanding the need for that investment in education, but not just investment. After the current looked at how to make us global, how to make us the best system in the global, comparing us across the globe in terms of education, understanding we were underinvesting everywhere in terms of that. We need that kind of massive data collection, massive effort in terms of mobilization to make the difference. What do you say about that?
Well, I stop me if I'm talking too much, but my other great civic hope is in education. And I've worked very closely with Britt Kerwin in pushing and pressing the case for his recommendations, which do envision Baltimore and Maryland being a world class. But there's a difference in the two movements. The education has come together more completely, more unified, is speaking with a much more singular, effective voice. Our transportation advocacy has been scattered and balkanized, in part because the business community, while it's perceived to be strong, is actually scattered and balkanized in this region as well. So we need advocates at every level. And most great change comes from the bottom up. Very rarely does it come top down. So really, everybody needs to start to join the chorus on this. And the studies that you're talking about and the data that Dr. Chavis talks about incorporating into our policy, those are all elements into creating a Kerwin-like movement.
Samuel, you were going to jump in?
Yes, I would second a number of motions already on the floor. Jim's, Dr. Chavis, certainly, Jonathan, Sefu, that about covers it, doesn't it? Because they've all pointed to a direction we have to take. One is we can't shy away from doing what we need to do because the agency won't do it. We have to take this matter in our own hands. The idea of overcoming the strictures we have in public transportation now are up to us. The ridership, the people, anybody of goodwill who wants to move in that direction toward fairness and a fair society, well, they're welcome, of course. But we're looking at the needs for understanding public transportation and transportation generally. We have to speak about the environment. Climate change requires a greater emphasis on mass transit. We've got to get people out of there smoking automobiles. We're all dying with this. Mother Earth is in deep trouble. The most modest approach is 10 years to zero emissions. You know, we're hoping that will help, but we're past probably 2.50 temperature now, perhaps. The science is not with us at the moment. The science is telling us we are very late addressing this issue with transportation and single occupation internal combustion engines. We're late with that. So we know we have to cut that down. The idea of more transit widening policies is of the last 2 centuries. It's a century ago. We need to abandon it now if we are going to be surviving economically and in terms of health and the environment. So we have every mandate to move ahead with a new approach. We can't leave this pandemic era doing the same things we did beforehand. This is an opportunity to take a look at what we've learned and act on what we've learned.
So I know that Jonathan and Sefu want to jump in here. I'm going to add another question. I want you to jump in where you want to, but I'm going to add this other question to tag on, and that is, why is that the 2002 rail plan has been wholly discarded at this point? It is clear that those routes are today still the densest and most transit-hungry areas. Many were included in the new plan as high priority routes, but they also too timid to say that it needs to be rail. But I'm gonna tag that on as a question to answer after you jump in on this issue. Jonathan?
Yeah, what I wanted to say was, you know, I'm listening and I wanted to somewhat provide a solution for business to get involved, because the entry-level employees are always replaceable, and those individuals take the bus. Until workflow has been disrupted and your executives have to take transportation, then it's going to become a problem, because once it starts to disrupt the profit of the business, then that becomes a huge issue. Like, there's one of the top execs that runs a bank in New York City. He takes public transportation. and the route that he takes is always on time. And it's always on time, probably for a reason. You know, until executives get uncomfortable and really understand the plight of their employees at the entry level state, businesses will always do what businesses do. You know, Port Covington has their own, well, Under Armour has their own bus line that goes there. You know, and I'm sure it runs on a regular basis, on a consistent basis during business hours. But after business hours, it's probably real iffy. So I would encourage executives to take the bus. Try taking the bus for 30 days as your primary mode of transportation, and come back and then start advocating. Because now, instead of you being sympathetic, put yourself in a situation where you're empathetic.
Thank you. Sefu, let me let.
Go ahead, Chikelu.
And then we'll come back.
Jonathan said it best. I was going to say the same thing. It's not hard to have empathy or compassion on people who rely on transit, but it makes it a little bit better when you've been in that position. And in the same way that, you know, the same way that we chastise, for example, a police officer who does a photo op with a little child, right, a little Black child, to kind of, you know, try to shift the narrative with that. That's kind of what happens with public transit with a lot of politicians, is that most times when you see a politician on a bus, it's usually for a photo op. It's usually to say, look at me, you know, I've got a car, but I'm on the bus. And we just have to really shift the narrative of you know, we really need to push for real accountability from elected officials. And if you're going to ride the bus, ride it to get a perspective that you don't have. Don't ride it for a photo op, don't ride it for an opportunity, but really ride the bus and see from our perspective what we go through on a day-to-day basis. And so I can't name any council person, I can't name any elected official in the city that rides the bus frequently. I do know of some that have ridden the bus just to kind of say that they did. And I know that there were a few that did. I believe when Link first started out, it was free for about a week or 2 weeks. And there were a few politicians who supposedly rode the bus then. But it still doesn't come from a level of empathy and compassion that would move them to any tangible change in the long run.
Thank you. Samuel? Thank you.
Yes, and there's something I want to just mention we haven't quite addressed. The fight against two stigma. Public transportation is saddled with two unsubstantiated stigma. One is the stigma of Black crime, that you're going to get robbed, you know, or you're going to have some unpleasant experience, or your daughter's going to talk to a rapper. The second stigma is that there's Black disease. You know, no studies whatever have shown that public transportation is a super spreader. In fact, during the SARS and MERS epidemics of 2009, 2008, so no more than 4 to 5% of transmission events occurred or were associated with public transportation. Even the New York MTA has just recently issued a statement saying they're not finding public transportation being the heart of the pandemic in New York. In fact, the issue is where you spend most time, not just being close to someone who has the virus, but how much time you're exposed. You're exposed more in a all-day office or a crowded restaurant than in 25, 30 minutes on public transportation. That's one. With respect to Black crime, you're safer on public transportation than you are in the grocery store. Studies already show that. But we need everybody to fight for building trust in public transportation. That's how we're going to get public policy to improve and increase investments. We're proposing the cleanest ride in town. Available technologies now can make a quick temperature check at the door, have coverings on the most often touched surfaces, and put ultraviolet in the HVAC system, all for less than we're planning when we're talking about buying a new bus. We should explore these, make these investments, bring more people back to public transportation, and at once solve certain questions. Economic development with light rail, of course, the red line, we can do that. More people on the bus, reducing congestion and the impact on the environment. And we address issues also with public health when we intend to do so. So we need to fight those two stigma as well when we're talking about elevating public transportation in the investment profile of the agency and of the business community.
Thank you very much, Samuel, in terms of that piece. One of the, again, going to our audience to make sure we get the questions in, is the question was around the fact, what about the red line? What about Penn Station? What are your responses? What about the red line?
Friends, the red line is not dead, and it can be built. You know, in spite of the no-sayers. In fact, the only no-sayers are actually the administration. When Larry Hogan was elected, came to office, the red line was fully approved, fully funded, had a record of decision, and was shovel ready. He conceded to the segregationist history of the region and of the state, rescinded $900 million, you know this, to the federal government, the largest grant in infrastructural transportation support from the Obama administration, proving he was a Republican tough guy. But he spent the rest of the money on roads and highway projects around the state where his white constituents live in order to guarantee his re-election. That succeeded. If Ben Jealous had $1 billion to sprinkle around the state, he'd be governor. What happens though is that these investments were part of a trend that we've seen continue since the cancellation of the red line to these cuts proposed September 1st. They were always visited upon the transit reliant, upon Black and brown communities. So the red line, 10,000 jobs is worth fighting for in itself. Dramatically reduced commute times. The transit-oriented development, $6.5 billion of transit-oriented development along with 3,000 permanent jobs. Proof of this, look to WMATA. In fact, look at the Purple Line. It's having some problems with the contractors, but even though a year and a half after the groundbreaking, the Purple Line has already attracted $12 billion in project commitments. That's the kind of money that would be coming to Baltimore were we building the red line. We would be on the red line next October had we not had Governor Hogan's cancellation. It's worth fighting for. We can build it. It only needs the money. We'll talk about that when we can. We'll talk about that. It needs a political will. It needs bold vision from the policymakers and the elected officials. And it also needs the reevaluation of the environmental impact statement, which can take 12 months. If you have friends in Washington, it can take 8 months. But if you don't have any friends in Washington, D.C., it can take 12 to 14 months. This is a verity. This is a truth. We can do it. We needn't look anywhere else because there's no other project on the table, on the agenda anywhere that has 10,000 jobs and can get you from Bayview in the east to Woodlawn CMS in the west in 45 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else want to add to that response back to the red line regarding or Penn Station from Jim?
Yeah, there was a question about the 2002 transit plan.
Yes.
I think it was from Logan, which is very good. Logan, just rest assured that my mouse pad has the map from the 2002 plan. And so it's not entirely dead, it's just mostly dead. I thought that and in fact, the Transit Planning Commission that I served on was supposed to, in effect, update it. Well, the 2002 plan had a very neat arrangement of about, I'm going to say, 5 or 6 lines, one of which was the red line. It was the basis on which the red line proceeded. So instead of updating it, what this recent plan that's going to be presented to the General Assembly in January has 30 lines running through Baltimore City. It's like a bowl of spaghetti. And so it's not good artwork. Who cares? Well, we need to focus our attention on what Samuel is talking about. We need the red line. It's pretty simple. You don't need 30 other corridors to mix you up. I think, in fact, all that is a way of preserving the status quo. But Logan, the 2002 plan still lives because it makes sense.
So I'm still looking at other questions in terms of that. On the red line, can be vigilant, none of the right of way is given away that's needed for the project and already signed a cat. And I think somebody, this is talking more about the red line and what would be needed to move it forward in terms of that. Another question that comes from our audience, and trying to rapidly look at the questions, is, and this is not a question, but it's something that I want to lift up, because something that I think we, ABC, should spend more time on in partnership with all of you. And that is, we should figure out a way to do another kind of forum like this, not so much a webinar, but maybe a forum where we bring more workers' voices to the table. So if you added a great deal of value in this conversation. Jonathan, as a writer, as an employer writer, you have as well. But I think we have to figure out a way to bring more worker voices to this table in terms of the larger conversation and tie that together with some of the policy conversation. I think people truly, truly do not understand the power and the greatness and the absolutely phenomenalness that's available in Black and brown people. Having a job in terms of in any sector is a positive thing. It's not a negative in terms of that. We've now lifted up, I think you said that, Samuel, our service workers and the essential workers in healthcare. Now, all of us, in terms of understanding that workers that are in the grocery stores, all that nobody could live without right now. We're not disposable people in terms of we're powerful people. And we need to bring the voices of our workers across, those that have to do the last mile, those that want a job outside the L. We need to think about taking that to the next level as a conversation that we lift up in terms of having worker voices. And then what do workers need even to be a part of pushing this agenda forward, along with all the wonderful things that are going on from all of you all. I am mindful of the time and mindful, again, thank you all in terms of our participation from our audience and that. And let's be clear, this will not be the last conversation you will hear from our panelists, as well as we will invite others. We will do additional webinars in 2021 on this issue. And we will think about doing even kind of an evening event, perhaps, that I'm going to ask our panelists to join us in organizing that can bring worker voices to this conversation in terms of what they're experiencing. It's nothing like hearing it from people who are impacted in terms of what's going on in their lives and how different it could be. But with that, I want to ask and give to each panelist an opportunity to make a closing comment in terms of what you feel is really critical for this audience to hear from you today in terms of that. And Sefu, I'm going to start with you in terms of that.
Yeah, again, thank you for having me. And I just want to close out by saying that the stigma is definitely real. And I was reading something a few days ago that said that one of the best ways to change the way that transit is run in many cities across the country is to not look at it as we are poor and downtrodden and that we just need a way to get to work. But if we shift that narrative in the interest of, politicians and elected officials somehow looking at transit as something worth more than what they're seeing. And while I would agree with that, I would also suggest that we shouldn't just look at transit riders as more than just poor, broke, or downtrodden just to get a better system, but because that's just not who we are as people. And so I just would encourage everyone listening to dig deeper into the humanity of bus riders, and not just the system itself, but the people and the lives and the individuals and the families and the relationships and everything that goes into a successful transit system, not even just the system, but the people on these buses. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That statement and that sense of who people are that ride transit, Black and brown, there's no better way to have said that. I would say, in terms of my comment to that, Sefu is a lie from the pit of hell. But okay, that's not the commentary. Jonathan, in terms of, I'm very passionate about this issue of how Black and brown people are lifted up. We are not broken. We are people of greatness. Jonathan.
Yeah, I would just, this has been amazing. And I've been taking notes myself, not only being a panelist, but just listening. I would say that the bus is safe. I've been riding the bus for the last 5 years. I've had more negative altercations with Baltimore Police Department sitting on my own stoop than I had on the bus. It's a culture that's rooted in respect. And here's how it works. Women, children, and elderly always get on first when there are a number of people standing on the bus stop. You move to the side, you let people get on. When the handicapped or people that are disabled get on and off the bus, there's a level of patience and there's a level of help. And so when you drop something on the bus, people acknowledge it, like, hey, you dropped something, you know, you might want to pick that up. Or if you ask someone a question where your bus stop is, there's a level of communication to help you get from point A to point B. And so when people talk about the deficit narrative, it's because the media has steered it that way. And it has a role to play in how we position Black people, Black and brown people here in Baltimore City. And I would just encourage people to just try riding the bus. Try riding the bus on a great day when it's beautiful out. Try riding the bus on the worst day when it's raining and it's snowing. And you'll see how the people are incredibly respectful and that there's a culture that's put in place where it's conversation, it's unity, and it's about being very peaceful.
Thank you very much, Tyler. Thank you for participating. Dr. Celeste Chavis, please.
Thanks. This has been also, I would second, it's been a wonderful conversation, and I'm happy to be here as a panelist and as an attendee of this conversation. I guess one of the things that maybe struck out as I was listening to people talk is this idea that sometimes transit is kind of viewed as charity, and it's not charity having good transit. It makes economic sense. And I think if we can really keep that at the forefront of the conversations as we push for better policy, that this isn't about, you know, handouts or charity. This is really about making good economic sense for a thriving city and region. I would like to see those conversations move in that direction.
Thank you very much. Jim.
Yeah, sometimes great change needs an emergency, needs people to have a sense of urgency. And I'm here to tell you that Central Maryland and the city of Baltimore ought to be filled with urgency on transportation. Here's what's happening. All the transportation money in Maryland for the last 15 years, or a great percentage of it, has gone to the DC area. We haven't had an improvement in the Baltimore area for transit since 2000 or shortly before, 20 years plus, no investment. Now, look at where we are. The purple line down in Washington is in deep trouble. The private sector has walked off the job. The state may very well pick up the tab, transportation money, to the purple line. A year or two ago, we made as a state, made a huge commitment to WMATA to help fund it. And each year we pour millions and millions of dollars into WMATA, again, the DC area. The governor has his billions of dollars going into highways and widening the highways in the Washington, DC area again. Billions of dollars sliding down there. And add to all of that, COVID. And the burden that has put on the economy and therefore the ability of the cities and states to deal with issues like transportation. And if all that weren't bad enough, if we already had a great system or a good system or an adequate system, that would be one thing. But the system we've got isn't that. And more than that, it's not being funded itself. It wasn't just cuts to the operation. The backlog of capital needs for the transit system, for MTA generally, is in the billions of dollars. That's a backlog just to get us to the point where we have what we have today in a state of good repair. So I guess we could go drop further in this, but I don't know how. We're pretty close to the bottom. And if people can't get a sense of urgency over that, well, then maybe we won't have a good transportation system, but people will feel that urgency. It hits directly home. The one key factor, a study has shown, if you want to move out of poverty, the most important factor is your commute time. If you have a long commute time, your chances of moving out of poverty are almost nil. The shorter the commute time, the better chance you have. Transportation is at the core of what we need.
Thank you, Jim. Samuel.
Yes, thank you. I would keep my comments brief because I think it's clear from the discussions, the panelists, questions asked by the audience, that we owe ourselves a structural racism-free future. Nothing less. Nothing less. When we speak about the Black wealth gap, when we speak about the environment, public health, all these are connected in the way that public transportation has become an instrument of racist policy. The single most important suppressor of investments in public transportation is racism. We owe ourselves a future free of structural racism, first by meeting that with structural change, but also pursuing the projects, the policies that maintain it. As I mentioned earlier about equity being anticipatory and preventative as much as it is corrective and recovery or recuperative, we need to keep that in mind as well and walk ahead to a future in which Baltimore regains its place among the leading cities of the nation with an equitable, reliable, multimodal transportation system anchored by light rail. With that, we will build out a transportation system for Central Maryland. We only have to look 30 miles away at WMATA to see what an RTA does, a Regional Transportation Authority does, how it can operate, and what it makes in terms of the economic drive of the area. The difference between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore since 1975 is the metro. A future that Baltimore can share, can build for itself. We urge everybody to join us in the celebration of Baltimore Transit Equity Solidarity Day on December 21st. Our intent there is to, one, demonstrate solidarity with essential workers immediately. They need to know that those cuts were not going to be imposed without us backing them up. Ourselves, I'm a rider of transit. We also are using that date to get support, measure our support for a shift to a Regional Transportation Authority and our proposed amendment to the Baltimore City Charter to take the first steps toward building a Regional Transportation Authority. And we want to use that date as well. It's the 64th anniversary of the mass victory of Black essential workers over race-based transit policy in Montgomery, Alabama. 2018, the mayor issued a proclamation. We want a proclamation again, 2020, that celebrates Baltimore Transit Equity Solidarity Day. You hear a lot more from us over this next few weeks, but come out, show solidarity, support structural change, and give honor to Claudette Colvin and attorney Fred Gray, who will be our honored guests. They won that case in the Supreme Court. Claudette Colvin was arrested, the first person arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white person in Montgomery 9 months before Rosa Parks. Come out, stand up, devote 9 minutes at 11 o'clock to some observation, whether it's reflective or active, in person or virtual. Show that we need and can move forward. It's up to us.
Samuel, one last time. Give that date again, and we're going to close down, but give that date again. That's
the Baltimore Transit Equity Solidarity Day, December 21st.
December 21st.
December 21st.
2020. Again, yes. I want to thank you all. This has been phenomenal. We didn't have enough time. It could go on. I also want to say thank you again to Digital Harbor Foundation, to Kenny Class, who's been our technician, who's been absolutely our partner in terms of making these webinars flawless. Thank you so much, Kenny, for being behind the scenes. Thank you for our team in terms of Tiffany, Jonathan, Brian O'Malley in terms of so CMTA has just been astounding as a partner in getting this done. So Jim, I say that you as chair of CMTA in terms of Brian, thank you, but also in terms of Billy Malcolm, in terms of Baltimore Community Foundation. all of you in terms of for lending us your time. But again, I want you to know this is not just a webinar. This is the beginning of a partnership in terms of moving this agenda forward. We must address the issue of structural racism. We must address the issue of systemic racism. We must be clear this cannot continue to go on in transit. It impacts us economically in such very deep ways in terms of families, individuals, collectively, us as a state. Thank you again for joining us. And on behalf of Associated Black Charities, thank you to my team again in terms of putting together.